Power in the antebellum South was never quiet. It had to be seen. The plantation system demanded performance, the endless staging of superiority through wealth, cruelty, and control. Every gesture, every decision, every public word of a planter was designed to remind others of his supremacy. The men who owned hundreds of acres and human lives came to believe that power existed only when it was displayed. To control silently was not enough. It had to echo through the corridors of the estate to be witnessed and feared. In that world, authority was theater. Dinners were performances of abundance. Punishments were performances of discipline, and even private relationships became instruments of spectacle. The wealthy planter at the heart of this story was not unlike many of his peers. He believed that ownership conferred not only privilege, but a divine right to orchestrate the lives beneath his roof. His life had become a play in which he alone wrote the script, cast the roles, and demanded that others act their parts. The plantation was his stage, and cruelty was his applause. But there is something corrosive about such performances. When power depends on constant display, it also breeds constant insecurity. The need to be feared becomes a kind of hunger, never satisfied, always demanding a larger scene, a louder reaction. The planter's every action began to serve a single purpose, to remind others and himself that he was master. The irony, of course, is that the more he needed to prove his power, the less he actually possessed it. True authority never shouts, only fear does. Within this culture of spectacle, the planter's cruelty toward his household was not an accident, it was an expectation. To appear lenient was to appear weak. Neighbors measured a man's dominance by how ruthlessly he could control his dependents, his workers, his wife, even his children. It was a twisted calculus that confused respect with fear, love with obedience, and morality with image. And so a system built on spectacle began to consume itself. Public humiliation replaced justice, performance replaced purpose. Imagine living under that constant gaze, where every moment of life is theater, where private feeling is dangerous because it might betray the illusion of control. The wife's discomfort, the servant's silence, the field hand's bowed head, all became props in a drama whose central plot was domination. And the audience was everywhere: overseers, visiting planters, relatives, and even the enslaved themselves. The entire plantation functioned as both stage and witness, reinforcing the same lie, that one man's authority was as natural as the sun that scorched the fields. But power sustained by fear is never stable. The planter's need to demonstrate control began to erode his sense of self. When the human soul becomes dependent on others' submission to feel whole, it loses its own substance. He mistook obedience for loyalty, silence for respect, and spectacle for strength. In the mirror of his own creation, he began to see only emptiness, an empire of order built on moral chaos. This is the hidden tragedy of domination. It reduces both the oppressor and the oppressed to roles in a tragedy neither chose. The enslaved are stripped of freedom, but the master is stripped of peace. The enslaved body becomes a symbol of suffering, but the enslaving mind becomes a symbol of decay. Over time, the same walls that were built to contain others become the cage that imprisons the one who built them. The master, who must always perform strength, is never allowed to be human again. Philosophically, this dynamic is older than the plantation. Ancient empires, tyrants, and kings all discovered the same paradox: the pursuit of absolute power leads to absolute dependence. You must control others to feel whole, you must hurt to feel alive, you must be seen dominating to believe you exist. What begins as dominance ends as addiction. The plantation, then, was not merely an institution of labor, it was an institution of spiritual corruption. The wealthy planter's actions were shocking, yes, but not because they were unique. They were the logical conclusion of a system that taught men that cruelty was proof of manhood. His entire life had been shaped by a philosophy that replaced conscience with command. Every whip crack, every insult, every public humiliation reinforced a single, fatal belief that power justified itself. He was not simply cruel, he was convinced he was right. That conviction is what made the system so enduring and so destructive. When the spectacle finally collapsed, when the people he controlled no longer played their parts as expected, he faced a silence more terrible than rebellion. The applause of fear stopped, the mask of mastery slipped, and what remained was the simplest, most devastating truth: he had nothing left that was real. The wealth, the land, the forced obedience, all had been built to hide the hollow man inside. Once that illusion fell, the empire followed. This is not just a story of one planter in Alabama. It is a parable of how societies rot when they turn power into theater. Whenever leadership becomes performance, compassion disappears. Whenever authority depends on humiliation, humanity erodes. The plantation may have been a physical place, but its psychology still lingers in modern life, where we see control mistaken for confidence, arrogance mistaken for strength, and domination mistaken for respect. We are called to see beyond that illusion, to recognize that true power does not demand spectacle, it demands responsibility. It does not humiliate, it uplifts. It does not require witnesses, it requires conscience. The most powerful man is not the one who controls others, but the one who governs himself. The wealthy planter never learned that lesson. His story ends as all stories of unchecked domination end, with ruin. His need to display control ultimately exposed his lack of it. His theater of power became his confession of weakness. What he built to demonstrate superiority became the monument of his failure. And long after his house crumbled and his name was forgotten, the echo of that truth remained in the soil. That power without mercy is already decay. So when we look back on him, and on every empire that rose through the spectacle of control, we should not only condemn, but learn, because every time we choose image over integrity, we repeat his mistake. Every time we silence others to appear strong, we resurrect his ghost. In every society built on control, someone is chosen to embody the joke that power tells about weakness. On the Alabama plantation, that figure was the enslaved man whose body was unlike the others. He was smaller in stature, different in form, and for that difference he became both spectacle and scapegoat. The planter whose ego required constant theater found in him a living mirror for ridicule. Yet the irony is that what was meant to humiliate him revealed the moral deformity of those who laughed. The dwarf slave, history does not record his name, stood at the intersection of every contradiction the South tried to hide. In a culture obsessed with physical strength, symmetry, and breeding, his existence was a quiet rebuke. The system that claimed to own him could neither erase him nor fit him neatly into its hierarchy. He was forced to serve, yes, but his very body testified to the limits of control. It reminded the planter class that no amount of power could make creation itself conform to their will. And for that, they hated him. Those who live under tyranny often learn early that survival depends on silence. The dwarf slave survived by listening. His small frame made him inconspicuous, and from the edges of rooms he heard everything: the arguments, the cruelty, the boasting. He learned that those who call themselves masters are often most afraid of being seen as small. And he understood, long before the planter ever did, that ridicule is not a sign of confidence but of fear. The more loudly a man mocks another's body, the more deeply he is hiding from the flaws in his own soul. In the quiet of his servitude, the dwarf became an unintentional philosopher of suffering. He did not have the language of scholars, but he understood the human condition through experience. The way pain clarifies truth, the way endurance becomes a form of power. Every time he was made to stand before others as a curiosity, he absorbed the gaze without breaking. The humiliation that was meant to destroy him became the instrument of his understanding. He discovered what few in that house ever did, that dignity is not granted by circumstance, it is protected by conscience. To the planter and his peers, he was an oddity to be managed, a source of dark amusement. But to those who worked beside him in the fields and quarters, he represented something else entirely, a symbol that even the smallest body could carry an unbreakable spirit. They saw in him a reminder that power is not measured by size or voice or wealth. True power, the kind that cannot be bought or inherited, lives in the ability to withstand humiliation without surrendering the self. In that sense, the enslaved dwarf stood taller than any man who claimed to own him. What makes his story so profound is the moral reversal it exposes. The planter, towering in wealth and authority, appeared powerful but was enslaved by his own need to dominate. The dwarf, stripped of rights and mocked for his form, possessed a kind of inner freedom his master could never touch. This is the eternal paradox of oppression. that those who enforce it are always more imprisoned than those who endure it. The chains they place on others become the architecture of their own confinement. There is also something larger here, a commentary on how societies define worth. The planter's world measured value by conformity to an ideal, a perfect body, perfect bloodline, perfect obedience. The dwarf's very existence contradicted that fantasy. He exposed the moral bankruptcy of a civilization that equated symmetry with superiority. In the mirror of his difference, the South saw its own ugliness reflected back. And so, to silence that revelation, it turned difference into entertainment. Cruel laughter became its last defense against truth. Yet history teaches that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. The image of that small man standing before his masters, mocked but unbroken, became a wound in the conscience of those who witnessed it. They may have forgotten his name, but they remembered the feeling he stirred: discomfort, guilt, the faint recognition that they were wrong. That is the quiet rebellion of the oppressed, the ability to awaken conscience not through violence but through presence. He did not preach, he did not fight, yet his very being told a story that outlived the ones who tried to erase it. If we look deeper, his life invites us to question our own measure of strength. In our age, as in his, people still worship power in its loudest forms: money, status, control. We still mistake intimidation for leadership and difference for defect. But the dwarf's story whispers a harder truth, that moral height has nothing to do with physical stature. It belongs to those who refuse to let the cruelty of others define their humanity. His endurance is a mirror held up to every generation that confuses domination with greatness. When the curtain finally fell on that plantation's cruel theater, what remained was not the laughter nor the mockery, but the quiet integrity of the one who never had the chance to speak. His story, buried in silence, survived because it carried a universal truth, that the smallest person in the room may hold the greatest measure of grace. And the greatest power of all is not to command obedience, but to keep one's soul intact when the world insists you have none. The planter believed he owned that man's body. He never understood that he could not own his dignity. That is the lesson history keeps offering and we keep resisting, that worth is not something given by the powerful, but something revealed in the powerless. So when we speak of him now, we should not do so with pity but with respect. He stands as a witness across time, reminding us that cruelty is a confession of fear, and endurance is the quietest form of defiance. The world will always have those who build their strength on the backs of others. But the dwarf's life shows us another kind of power, the kind that cannot be displayed, only lived, the kind that makes tyrants uneasy and awakens the conscience of those who dare to watch. If we look closely, what unfolded between the planter, his wife, and the enslaved man was not a simple act of cruelty. It was the performance of a sickness that had long infected the southern psyche. Power in that world had become a theater, and every soul on that plantation was both actor and audience in a drama about humiliation, control, and the desperate search for meaning in a life built on lies. The planter, whose wealth insulated him from consequence but not from emptiness, used the people around him as mirrors to his own decay. Every command he gave, every degradation he orchestrated, was an attempt to feel alive through domination. Yet what he never realized was that each act stripped him further of the humanity he pretended to possess. His wife, mocked privately for her body, publicly for her docility, became another piece in that theater. Her obesity in the eyes of the household was not a physical trait but a symbol. It represented indulgence, excess, and the moral bloating of privilege. But beneath the gossip and laughter was a deeper truth. She was not gluttonous for food, but for acknowledgement. She had been starved of affection, belittled by the man who claimed to own everything, including her worth. And like the enslaved man forced into her presence, she too was a prisoner of that plantation's twisted moral geometry. There's something profoundly revealing about how societies express their sickness through the bodies of women. When a system becomes morally corrupt, it projects its guilt onto flesh, especially the kind that refuses to fit its ideals. Her body became a battleground for the insecurities of men who needed to see weakness in others to hide their own. Every insult thrown her way, every cruel joke told at her expense, was another brick in the wall of denial that protected their illusion of superiority. And in the middle of that cruel masquerade stood the enslaved dwarf, used, mocked, and yet somehow more spiritually intact than any of them. His body, like hers, became a vessel for the master's sickness. Both of them were reduced to objects through which he could rehearse his sense of dominance. But here's the paradox: the more he controlled them, the less control he had over himself. What began as a demonstration of ownership became an exposure of his fragility. The human soul cannot abuse others without corroding itself, and no plantation, no fortune, no law could protect him from that decay. If we strip away the historical context for a moment, what remains is a profoundly human equation: how fear disguises itself as arrogance. The planter's cruelty wasn't born from confidence, it was born from terror. The terror that he might not truly be in control, that the power he built his life upon was as hollow as the fields he ruled. His wife's quiet suffering mirrored his fear in a different form. She bore her humiliation silently, turning inward as her body became the canvas for his shame. And the enslaved man, standing small yet unbroken, represented the truth that haunted them both, that real strength is not found in domination but in endurance. This triangular tragedy exposes the anatomy of a dying order. The South of that era sustained itself on rituals of control. Not just physical control of the enslaved, but psychological control of its own members. Men like the planter convinced themselves they were gods in miniature, but in truth, they were prisoners of a system that demanded constant cruelty to survive. Their wives became victims of the same logic, made to embody their husbands' failures, to absorb their guilt in silence. And the enslaved, those who bore the weight of it all, became the unwilling carriers of a moral disease that was not theirs to bear. The most haunting part of this history is how easily humiliation becomes a language when empathy dies. Once a person learns to see others as extensions of their will, the line between human and object disappears. And when that happens, nothing sacred remains, neither love, nor marriage, nor faith. Everything becomes a transaction, a performance meant to keep despair at bay. That is what happened in that barn, not in the literal sense, but in the psychological one. It was the collapse of meaning beneath the weight of control, and yet, within that collapse, something astonishing endures. The enslaved man's dignity, quiet and unspoken, became a mirror to every soul who saw him. The wife's suffering, though silenced in life, became a testimony to the corrosive power of unchecked pride. Even the planter, in his moral ruin, stands as a cautionary symbol, a reminder that the need to dominate others is always a confession of weakness. In their intertwined pain, we see the anatomy of power laid bare. The question we must ask ourselves is not just what happened to them, but what happens to us when we stop seeing others as human. Because that same impulse, that same desire to control, still lives quietly in modern hearts. It hides behind status, behind technology, behind the illusion that we are different from those who came before. But the truth is unchanged. Whenever power becomes the goal instead of the responsibility, corruption follows. And perhaps that is the real story beneath this disturbing history, not the grotesque acts themselves, but what they reveal about human nature. The South was a mirror for a universal temptation to build identity through hierarchy, to define worth by how small we can make others feel. That temptation didn't end with slavery. It simply learned to disguise itself better. So when we revisit this story today, let it not be as spectators of cruelty, but as students of conscience. Let it remind us that no civilization, no relationship, no individual can sustain itself on humiliation. Those who degrade others will always end by degrading themselves. And those who endure with quiet strength, those who refuse to surrender their humanity, will outlast the empires that sought to erase them. There always comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, when the weight of what has been done begins to press inward. Power, for all its noise, has a way of creating silence. And it's in that silence that conscience begins to speak. For the wealthy planter, it began not with public shame or punishment, but with the smallest tremors of unease, the sleepless nights, the sense that every creak in the hallway was more than sound. It was memory. Guilt rarely arrives as confession. It seeps in like humidity, invisible but relentless, filling every space where pride once stood. It is a strange paradox of human nature that the oppressor becomes, in time, a captive of his own cruelty. He builds walls to keep others beneath him, but those same walls keep his conscience from escaping. The planter had constructed his entire life around control. The land, the people, the stories told about him. But once control becomes a god, it demands constant sacrifice. The more he exerted dominance, the more he had to blind himself to the suffering it created. And blindness, over time, corrodes perception. He could not see beauty without first imagining ownership. He could not see weakness without first feeling the urge to crush it. That is the great tragedy of unchecked power. It reshapes not just the world outside, but the moral vision within. The enslaved man and the wife, bound together by circumstance, had become mirrors of the master's own decay. They reflected back to him all that he tried to suppress: his cowardice, his insecurity, his need for validation disguised as superiority. When he looked upon them, he did not see people, he saw the parts of himself he feared most. And so, to destroy them, he had to destroy himself. That's how guilt operates. It turns the hunter into the haunted. History often paints such men as villains, but it's worth understanding them also as warnings. Because what happened to him is what happens to every soul that mistakes dominance for strength. It begins with justification. It's my right, my order, my rule. Then it hardens into habit. This is how the world works. And finally it becomes identity. Without this power, I am nothing. By the time conscience begins to whisper, the man no longer knows how to listen. His heart has been trained to hear only obedience, not truth. We often imagine evil as loud, dramatic, even theatrical. But the deeper form of evil is subtle. It is the moral numbness that grows each time a person witnesses suffering and chooses not to care. The planter's tragedy was not that he was cruel once. It was that cruelty had become normal to him. His laughter at others' pain no longer shocked his conscience, it fed it. Yet beneath that performance, something fragile still lived. Even the most corrupt heart retains a memory of goodness, and it was that faint pulse that began to trouble his nights. Guilt is proof that the soul, though sick, is not yet dead. Those who witnessed his decline said that his wealth no longer brought him joy. The meals grew smaller. The conversation turned to bitterness. He avoided mirrors, avoided the barn, avoided even his own reflection in water, because what he saw now was not the master of a plantation, but a man imprisoned by the ghosts of his own choices. Every cruelty demands a witness, but every conscience demands a reckoning, and the two cannot coexist for long. When we look at his story today, it's not to gloat over his downfall, but to recognize a universal truth. Moral corruption is not an event, it is a process. It begins invisibly in the heart's small compromises. When we justify what we know is wrong for the sake of comfort, profit, or pride, we plant the seeds of our own undoing. The planter's collapse was only the visible fruit of that invisible decay. His mansion stood tall, but its foundation had long since rotted. And yet, there is something profoundly human about that decay, because it reminds us that every act of injustice, whether large or small, first occurs in the imagination. The mind rehearses it, the heart excuses it, and then the body performs it. If we wish to change the world, we must first interrupt that rehearsal within ourselves. We must learn to listen when conscience still whispers before it begins to scream. What destroyed the master was not divine punishment or rebellion from below. It was the slow awakening of his own awareness. The very humanity he tried to suppress in others came back to claim him. That is the law of moral symmetry. The harm we cause does not vanish. It transforms and returns, reshaped into memory, regret, or madness, and the most merciful outcome is when it returns early enough to change us. For him it returned too late. So what do we take from this? Not pity, not fascination, but warning. Because the same psychology that destroyed him exists in quieter ways in our own world, in boardrooms, in politics, in homes where people mistake control for love. The plantation may be gone, but the need to dominate still wears new disguises. Every time we refuse empathy to maintain power, every time we silence truth to preserve comfort, we walk the same path he did, only with more polite language and modern tools. The lesson is simple but eternal. Power without reflection breeds ruin. The conscience you bury today will be the voice that haunts you tomorrow. and the justice you deny others will one day stand at your own door. So let the story of that planter and his broken conscience remind us not of distance, but of proximity, that beneath the costumes of history, we share the same human struggle to master not others but ourselves, because in the end no amount of wealth, land, or control can quiet a mind that knows what it has done. History teaches us that no sin remains contained. Every cruelty seeps beyond its moment, shaping not just the lives of its victims, but the moral architecture of entire generations. The planter's story did not end with his death, nor did the echoes of that barn fade when the doors finally shut. What was done in secrecy became a seed of corruption that lived on in those who stayed silent, in those who justified, and even in those who merely watched. This is the cruel genius of moral decay. It is contagious. It spreads not only through action but through indifference. The wife, once the object of ridicule and shame, carried her silence like a shroud. She did not speak of what happened. She did not need to. Her body told the story every day thereafter, its heaviness now less about flesh and more about grief. And yet, within her silence was also a strange kind of defiance. She refused to perform her pain for anyone's satisfaction. She bore it quietly, as women through centuries have borne the unspoken burdens of men's pride. And in that quiet bearing, there was a moral endurance that the world rarely celebrates. The courage to live on when all dignity has been stripped away. The enslaved man, too, carried his own mark. The world saw him as diminished, less than whole. But in truth, he embodied a resilience that no master could possess. For while the planter's conscience rotted beneath guilt, the enslaved man's soul, though scarred, remained alive. History remembers the powerful because they leave monuments, but it is the powerless who carry the moral memory of a nation. His survival was not just physical, it was ethical. He became the silent proof that strength has nothing to do with stature, that dignity cannot be stolen even when freedom is. And what of the planter? By the end, he had become a relic of his own arrogance, a man haunted not by ghosts, but by himself. The plantation that once thrived under his command grew quieter with every passing year. The fields seemed to resist his labor. The workers moved like shadows, silent but knowing. He could not command the same fear he once could, because fear itself had lost its meaning. Those who live by domination eventually discover that control is a brittle illusion. Once the illusion cracks, the only thing left is the emptiness behind it. What fascinates and frightens us about such stories is how closely they mirror the workings of the modern soul. We may not live on plantations anymore, but we have built subtler empires of ego, of image, of success. And like that planter, we sometimes measure our worth not by who we lift up, but by who we stand above. The forms have changed, the psychology has not. We exploit differently now through systems, through words, through the quiet comfort of distance, but the moral consequence is the same. When empathy dies, cruelty becomes reasonable. When truth becomes inconvenient, silence becomes moral decay. If you study the emotional geography of power, you find that it always circles back to fear. The powerful fear losing their status. The privileged fear being seen as ordinary. The oppressor fears judgment. And fear, when it festers long enough, transforms into justification. That's what the planter's life represents, the architecture of justification. Every cruel system, every social hierarchy, every private act of humiliation depends on a lie we tell ourselves that we are entitled to what others are denied. But the deeper truth, the one that history always exposes, is that no one escapes the consequences of their own justification. The harm we rationalize always returns, often in the form of emptiness, isolation, or decay of spirit. There's a kind of poetic symmetry to it all. The woman who was mocked for her body became the quiet conscience of the household. The man who was enslaved became a symbol of endurance. And the master who held all power became the most pitiful of them all. A man undone not by rebellion or vengeance, but by his own unexamined heart. That is how moral laws operate. They are not enforced by courts or armies. They are written into the fabric of human consciousness. You can ignore them for a time, but you cannot escape them forever. And perhaps that is the central revelation of this entire story, that the plantation, with all its brutality and spectacle, was never just a physical institution. It was a psychological one. It existed in the imagination before it existed in the soil. The real chains were made of belief. Belief in superiority, belief in entitlement, belief that domination could coexist with righteousness. Once those beliefs were accepted, the rest followed naturally: cruelty disguised as order, greed disguised as destiny, silence disguised as peace. But conscience has a long memory. It can sleep for generations, but it never dies. And that is why we return to stories like this, not for the horror, but for the mirror they hold up. We are meant to see ourselves in them, to recognize the ways we too participate in systems that dehumanize, even if those systems wear different faces now. The lesson is not simply to condemn the past, but to interrogate the present. What are the barns of our age? The hidden places where human dignity is traded for convenience or profit? Who are the ones we mock, overlook, or silence to keep our comfort intact? If there is redemption in this story, it lies not in erasing what happened, but in acknowledging it fully. The past cannot be undone, but it can be understood, and in that understanding lies transformation. Because to remember rightly is to refuse repetition. The wife's endurance, the enslaved man's quiet dignity, even the planter's moral collapse, each is a page in the same book of human reckoning, and we are still writing its final chapters. So let this part of the story remind us, the true measure of power is not how many obey, but how many are uplifted. The true mark of freedom is not ownership, but empathy. And the truest form of strength is not the ability to command, but the courage to confront oneself. Every story of cruelty must end with a reckoning, not always the kind that history records. Not a courtroom verdict or a public fall, but the quiet, personal reckoning that happens inside the conscience of a people. What we do not repent, we repeat. What we refuse to remember, we relieve. And so the plantation, though it may have rotted into the earth, never truly disappeared. Its ghosts still walk among us, not as apparitions in the night, but as unexamined ideas that live in the heart: the hunger for power, the fear of equality, the temptation to measure worth by dominance. You see, the tragedy of the planter and his household was never confined to one family or one century. It was an echo of something larger, the universal law that every generation inherits the moral debts of those before it. The South paid that debt in war, but the deeper payment, the inner one, is still being made in every mind that must confront what was built on suffering. That's why stories like this matter. They are not about the dead, they are about the living. They are about the way conscience travels, about how evil seeps quietly into ordinary hearts when history is turned into myth. For the people of that time, it was easy to justify what they did. They spoke of property, of law, of order. But justification is just a polite mask for fear. The fear that without someone to stand beneath us, we might have to face the weight of our own insignificance. That fear drives nations, families, and individuals alike to commit unspeakable acts while calling them necessary. And when the deed is done, when the dust settles, the fear remains, demanding new victims, new rationalizations, new ways to avoid the mirror. The planter's fall, therefore, was not merely personal. It was prophetic. His life revealed the pattern that repeats whenever pride replaces empathy. He believed he could control the terms of existence, that wealth could silence conscience, that social rank could rewrite morality. But human nature does not obey such illusions. Every cruelty creates a fracture in the spirit that inflicted it. Every act of humiliation builds a monument to the humiliated, not the humiliator. The plantation system thought it was writing history through control, yet it was actually engraving its shame into the moral DNA of a nation. That is why, long after the fields lay barren and the great houses turned to ruin, the moral consequences endured. You can still feel them in the unease that runs beneath the surface of modern life. The quiet suspicion that the systems we trust are built upon old injustices never truly buried. It is not enough to condemn the planter, we must recognize the part of him that lives in all of us. That subtle desire to dominate, to dictate, to be seen as superior in some hidden way, that is the modern plantation of the human ego. And so, as we come to the final act of this reflection, the question shifts from, what happened to them, to, what is happening to us? Because the human heart has not changed as much as we like to believe. We still build hierarchies, still turn difference into justification, still mistake comfort for virtue. The setting is new, but the psychology is ancient. We build new plantations of technology, of class, of ideology, each designed to convince us that some lives matter less than others, that empathy is weakness, that self-interest is destiny. But history keeps proving the opposite, that every attempt to rise through the subjugation of others ends in spiritual collapse. If there is any redemption in this story, it lies in awareness, in the act of seeing clearly what generations before us refused to face. The wife's suffering, the enslaved man's endurance, even the master's eventual ruin, all of it serves as a moral blueprint for what happens when love and conscience are silenced by power. The challenge is not to watch these tragedies from a distance, but to hear what they are still saying, that morality is not a performance, but a discipline, that compassion is not weakness, but wisdom, that the soul cannot remain divided without consequence. When we look back at those haunted estates and ruined barns, we are not simply studying the past, we are studying ourselves, because every human being at some point must decide whether to build or to break, to heal or to harm. History does not repeat because it forgets, it repeats because we forget. The lesson of the planter's story is not about punishment, it is about prevention. It warns us that the line between power and cruelty, between order and oppression, is thinner than we imagine. And yet there is hope in this reckoning, because once a truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. Once the mind awakens to its own capacity for cruelty, it also awakens to its capacity for grace. The real victory of history is not in the fall of the wicked, but in the awakening of the living. We can choose differently. We can build systems rooted in dignity rather than domination, relationships grounded in respect rather than fear. But first, we must have the courage to name the ghosts, not to banish them, but to learn from them. That is what this story ultimately asks of us, not pity, not outrage, but responsibility. The responsibility to ensure that the silence of the past does not become the language of the present. The responsibility to recognize that the plantation was not just a place in history, it was a state of mind. And until that mind changes, history remains unfinished. So, as we close this reflection, remember this: the greatest act of courage is not to rewrite the past, but to redeem the present, because every generation is given the same choice that the planter once ignored: to build power upon fear, or to build meaning upon empathy. One destroys the soul, the other restores it. And that is where the true revolution begins, not on the land, not in the laws, but in the human heart.